He was out there for the photos, not to save lives. But when Daniel found the bear bleeding in the moss, something told him to stay. He didn't know it then, but that choice would echo back to him years later. The morning air was damp and heavy with the smell of rain, the kind that lingered in the forest long after a night storm. Daniel Reed, camera bag slung over his shoulder, moved quietly along the narrow deer trail. At 48, with a lifetime of wildlife photography behind him, he had learned to walk like part of the woods, slow, deliberate, no sudden movements. His boots sank softly into the moss, each step absorbed by the earth. The forest was waking, a squirrel chattering overhead, the soft drip of water from pine needles, a woodpecker knocking somewhere deeper in the trees. Daniel had come here for one reason, to catch the early light on the river bend, where mist curled off the surface like steam from a hidden fire. But he never made it to the river. The sound reached him first, not the rhythmic noises of the forest, but something strained, unsteady. A grunt, deep and ragged, followed by a low, rumbling exhale. He froze, every muscle tensing. In his experience, there were only a few things in these mountains that could make a sound like that, and most of them you didn't want to get too close to. Still, curiosity, or maybe instinct, pulled him forward. He moved slowly, camera forgotten at his side, until the trees thinned just enough for him to see into a small clearing. And there it was. The bear was massive, its black coat slick with rain and matted with mud. It stood awkwardly, one foreleg bent at an unnatural angle, and even from a distance Daniel could see the crimson streak along its side. The wound wasn't fresh, not from today, but it was bad enough to make the animal sway slightly with each breath. For a long moment, neither moved. The bear's head turned, its dark eyes locking onto his. Daniel expected the usual reaction, a huff, a turn, maybe a slow retreat into the trees. Instead, the bear simply stood there, breathing heavily, as though weighing whether he was a threat. Daniel's chest tightened. He could leave. It would be the smart thing. But the bear's weight was shifted wrong, its movements sluggish. If it couldn't feed or defend itself, it wouldn't last. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel knew he wouldn't sleep tonight if he walked away now. He set his camera bag down slowly, keeping his eyes on the bear, and reached for the small field kit he always carried, mostly meant for himself in case of injury. He moved in a low crouch, speaking softly, though the words didn't matter. His tone was calm, almost conversational. The bear didn't move until he was within 10 feet. Then it lowered itself to the damp ground with a slow, heavy motion, its head still turned toward him. Daniel eased closer, the pounding of his own heart loud in his ears. The wound was a clean entry, bullet, by the look of it. Likely from a hunter who had missed the mark or been careless. Daniel worked quickly, cleaning around the gash with what antiseptic he had, flushing out dirt and fragments. The bear flinched once, a low rumble in its throat, but didn't strike. When he saw the glint of metal, Daniel took a breath, tightened his grip, and pulled. The bullet came free with a wet sound, rolling into his palm, small, copper-jacketed. He dropped it into his pocket and pressed a folded bandage against the wound, holding it there as rain began to fall again in a soft, steady mist. Minutes passed. The bear's breathing steadied, though its eyes never left his. Finally, Daniel eased back, giving the animal space. It didn't run. It didn't even rise right away. It just watched him, massive and still, as he packed away his kit. When he finally stepped back toward the tree line, the bear lifted its head once, like a silent acknowledgement, before disappearing into the shadows. Daniel stood there long after it was gone, the wet smell of pine and earth filling his lungs. He knew it was probably the last time he'd see that bear. But as he walked back toward the trail, the weight of the bullet in his pocket felt strangely like a promise. The forest had changed in 3 years. The storm-felled pines near the ridge had sprouted new shoots, and the old game trails had shifted, worn smooth by deer hooves and the passage of seasons. But Daniel's routine hadn't. He still returned every few weeks, camera slung over his shoulder, looking for moments that told quiet stories. It was early autumn now, the air sharp with the promise of winter. That morning, Daniel had set out to photograph a family of elk rumored to be grazing near the south meadow. He never made it there. Halfway down a narrow ravine, he caught movement in his peripheral vision, not the quick, erratic flash of a deer, but something heavier, deliberate. He froze, scanning the undergrowth. That's when he saw it. The bear. Even in the muted light, the nick on its left ear was unmistakable. Its coat gleamed, thick and full, a living wall of black fur. It stood calmly on the slope above him, breathing slow clouds into the cold air. For a long heartbeat, Daniel simply stared, memory rushing back in a flood, the rain, the wound, the copper-jacketed bullet in his pocket. The bear huffed once, tilting its head, and then turned away, not retreating, but moving at a pace that almost felt purposeful. Daniel's gut told him to follow. They traveled in silence, weaving through gullies and over mossy ridges, deeper into the forest than he'd gone in years. The bear never bolted, never seemed spooked, but kept just far enough ahead to remain in control of the pace. Finally, they reached a rocky clearing where the air felt different, still, heavy. Daniel's eyes adjusted to the dimness under the canopy, and that's when he saw her. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, sat against a boulder, her clothes soaked, one boot missing. Her left ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle, and her skin had the pallor of someone who'd been out here too long. She looked up as he approached, relief flashing in her eyes. "I thought no one would find me," she rasped. Daniel crouched beside her, already reaching for the emergency radio in his pack. "You're lucky someone knew where to look." She frowned weakly. "Someone." He glanced over his shoulder. The bear stood at the tree-line, watching, not moving closer, but not leaving either. Daniel called in her location, his voice low but steady. As he waited for confirmation, he offered her water from his canteen and wrapped his spare thermal blanket around her shoulders. When the rescue team finally arrived, the bear was gone, melting back into the forest like smoke. That night, sitting at his desk with the day's images uploading to his hard drive, Daniel reached into his desk drawer. The bullet from 3 years ago still sat there, dull with age. He turned it over in his palm, thinking about how impossible the day had been, and yet, how strangely inevitable it felt. The woman's rescue made the local paper, lost hiker found after 2 days in backcountry, but her account of the search left out one key detail. Daniel hadn't mentioned the bear. It wasn't the kind of thing you put in an official statement. Most people wouldn't believe it. But Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. For weeks, he replayed the scene in his mind, the deliberate pace, the way the bear had waited at the ravine's edge, the steady gaze that felt more like recognition than coincidence. By late November, the first snow had dusted the mountaintops. One morning, while photographing the frost patterns along the riverbank, Daniel noticed something odd, fresh bear prints in the snow. Not unusual this time of year, some stragglers delayed their hibernation, but these prints weren't random. They followed the tree-line in a deliberate path, curving toward the ridge where he'd first seen the bear years ago. Something in him stirred. Against his better judgment, he followed. The tracks wound through a stand of old pines, where the air was still and muffled. The deeper he went, the more he noticed, the broken branch here, the patch of disturbed snow there, small signs that this wasn't just a bear's wandering. It was leading somewhere. When he finally broke through the tree-line, his breath caught. In a small clearing, partially hidden by snowdrifts, was a fallen tree with its roots ripped up, revealing the dark mouth of an opening beneath. The bear was there. Not alone. Two smaller bears, younger but strong, stood nearby. The big one looked at Daniel, then stepped aside, almost like an invitation. Daniel approached cautiously, crouching at the opening. The smell of damp earth and pine resin was strong, and inside the hollow he saw metal. An old tin box, rusted but intact. He pulled it free. The lid creaked as he opened it. Inside were folded papers, yellowed with age, and a faded photograph of a man in an old ranger's jacket, standing in front of a cabin. On the back of the photo, in neat handwriting, for whoever listens. The papers were brittle but legible, old ranger logs from the 1950s, detailing rescues, wildlife encounters, and one peculiar entry about 3 orphaned cubs found in winter storm. Daniel's chest tightened. He looked up. The bears were still there, watching. The younger ones shifted their weight, but the big one stood solid, unblinking. It wasn't random. It never had been. Daniel closed the box gently, tucking it into his pack. "Thank you," he whispered, the words vanishing into the cold air. The big bear huffed once, then turned, leading the younger ones back toward the shadows of the forest. Within moments, they were gone. Daniel stood there for a long time, the snow falling soft and steady around him. In the distance, the forest seemed to breathe, alive with a history he had only just begun to understand. Daniel didn't go home right away. The tin box in his pack felt heavier than it should, and not just because of its rusted frame. There was weight in the story it carried, something he sensed wasn't meant to stay buried again. He took the long way back to the cabin, following the river until the sound of rushing water drowned out the noise in his head. He kept glancing into the trees. Not expecting to see the bears again, but not entirely ruling it out. When he finally reached his desk, he set the box down carefully. His cabin was warm from the wood stove, but his fingers still trembled slightly as he unfolded the brittle pages. The earliest log was dated January 14, 1954. Blizzard caught me halfway to the South Ridge. Found 3 cubs in the drift. No sign of the sow, carried them back. Don't know if they'll make it through the night. Feels wrong to leave them. Daniel ran his thumb over the name signed at the bottom, H. McAllister. He read on, following the trail of entries. The ranger had kept notes on the cubs' recovery, right down to the day they were transferred to a wildlife rehab center. The last mention came months later, in June. Released back near Cedar Hollow. Watched them run into the pines. Wind from the ridge carried the smell of rain. Could have sworn the smallest one looked back. Daniel leaned back in his chair. It was the same ridge where he'd first seen his bear. And, smallest one, the phrasing made his skin prickle. The other papers weren't official logs. They were personal notes, sketches of bear tracks, brief thoughts about trust between species, and one folded letter that seemed almost out of place. The handwriting was smaller, careful. "If they remember me, I hope it is not for food or fear, but for shelter. I have no right to expect it, but I hope." Daniel closed his eyes. He could picture the man, older now, leaning on a cane perhaps, watching the forest from his porch, wondering if 3 small lives would ever cross his path again. The photograph was the final piece. The man's lined face held no forced smile, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that not every rescue ended in a handshake or a thank you. Daniel set the photo on his mantle. Something in him knew it wasn't just a piece of history. It was a connection, the same one that had pulled those bears toward him at the ravine. That night, he built a fire in the stove and wrote until his hand ached. Not a newspaper article. Not something for the public. A story, one he wasn't ready to share yet. One that might never leave this cabin. But every few lines, his eyes wandered to the window toward the dark edge of the forest. The tin box sat on the table beside him, still faintly smelling of earth and pine. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an open door. The next morning, Daniel set out early. The air was sharp with cold, and the forest was still heavy with last night's frost. He strapped the tin box securely into his pack and took the snowpacked trail toward Cedar Hollow's small main street. The ranger's name, H. McAllister, wasn't exactly rare in these parts, but the dates in the logs gave him a starting point. He pushed open the door to the local historical society, where the scent of old paper and pine polish filled the narrow room. A woman in her 70s sat behind the desk, knitting. She looked up, eyes narrowing at the sight of the box Daniel carried. "That's no tourist curiosity," she said without preamble. Daniel explained where he'd found it, leaving out the part about the bear watching from the tree lean. He showed her the logs, the photograph, the folded letter. She ran her fingers gently over the faded ink. "Hank," she said finally. "He was a fixture here. Couldn't walk through town without him tipping his hat to someone. Folks said he had a strange way with animals. Not in a foolish way, more like they knew him." She shuffled into the back room and returned with a black ledger. "Volunteer rosters," she explained. Her finger traced a line. "Harold Hank McAllister. Ranger until 86. Passed in 92. Lived alone out by the South Ridge." Daniel copied the address, though he doubted the cabin would still be standing. As he turned to leave, the woman added quietly, "They buried him under the oak on his property. Said it was his favorite spot to watch the ridge line. People still leave flowers there." The drive took him an hour. The cabin was long gone, only a collapsed chimney remained, but the oak stood tall, its roots tangled over a low rise. There was no marker, just a flat stone with moss edging its surface. Daniel knelt, setting the tin box at the base of the tree. He didn't say much. Words felt like intrusions here. The sound reached him before he saw anything, a low, rolling breath, steady and close. He turned slowly. The massive bear was there again, scarred ear catching the pale sunlight. This time, the other two were clearer, standing a little ahead of the shadows. Daniel didn't move. The big bear stepped forward, lowering its head until it was almost level with the tin box. It sniffed it once, then looked back at Daniel with that same unreadable calm. They stayed like that for what felt like minutes. Then the bear turned, huffed once, and led the younger two into the trees. Daniel sat there long after they'd gone, the echo of their presence lingering in the air. On the drive back, he thought about the line in Hank's letter, "If they remember me, I hope it is not for food or fear, but for shelter." It occurred to him that maybe they did remember, and maybe, just maybe, they were still watching. Daniel didn't expect to see the bears again so soon. The encounter under the oak had felt final, like closing a chapter he hadn't even realized he'd been writing. But just 4 days later, they were back. It was early morning, frost still clinging to the grasses in the meadow behind his cabin. Daniel was splitting wood, his breath fogging in the crisp air. The rhythmic crack of the axe stopped when Atlas, his old shepherd mix, gave a low, rumbling growl. Daniel followed the dog's gaze toward the tree line. There, between the slanting shadows of the pines, stood the big bear. The scar on its ear caught the sunlight, and behind it, just visible through the mist, the younger two waited. They didn't approach. Didn't move. Just watched. It wasn't fear that stirred in Daniel's chest, it was something quieter. The same feeling he'd had at the oak, a sense of being measured. He set the axe aside, raising one hand slowly in acknowledgement. The big bear gave a short huff, almost a greeting, then turned and melted into the forest, the others following. It happened again a week later. This time, Daniel was deep in the western range, photographing frost-laced spruce branches for the park's winter guide. He heard movement behind him, heavy but deliberate. When he turned, the three were there, closer than before. The big bear's gaze was steady, unblinking, but the younger one's attention was elsewhere. Their heads tilted toward the ravine below, ears twitching. Daniel followed their line of sight. At first, he saw nothing but tangled underbrush and ice. Then the faintest sound reached him, the muffled thud of something moving, followed by a sharp yelp. He scrambled down carefully, boots sliding on frosted leaves. The source revealed itself, a stray dog, thin and tangled in a snare wire, eyes wide with pain and panic. Daniel worked fast, speaking in a low voice as he freed the wire from the animal's paw. The dog bolted the second it was loose, disappearing into the trees. When he looked back up the slope, the bears were gone. But he knew they'd led him there. That night, he sat at his desk, Hank's tin box beside him. He spread out the contents, the log entries, the photograph, the letter. He studied the handwriting again, imagining Hank's voice in the words. They move through the forest like it's part of them, not something they cross. I hope they always find shelter when they need it. Daniel began digging into the park archives, requesting old patrol logs and incident reports. There were notes about Hank being seen far from his assigned routes, in the middle of storms, at odd hours. Unrecorded patrols, they called them. And in those same months, the records showed a pattern: strange rescues. Lost hikers found near ravines, injured animals located deep in the wilderness. Daniel started to map it all out on his wall, dates, locations, and now his own 2 encounters. The pattern was undeniable. It was like the bears weren't just surviving here. They were watching. Moving. Guarding. But guarding what, or who? The next time Daniel saw them, it was different. It wasn't at dawn or in the safe distance of the meadow. This time, the encounter came deep in the northern wilds, farther than he'd ever wandered without a specific assignment. It had started as a routine wildlife check. A storm 2 nights prior had toppled several old spruce along the river, and the Park Service needed someone to assess the damage. Daniel volunteered, partly out of habit, partly because lately he'd been hoping to see them again. The day was cold but bright, the sky that sharp winter blue that made the snow look almost too white to touch. He moved slowly through the drifts, making notes on his clipboard, when a sound caught him off guard, a low, steady chuff. He turned, and there they were. The big bear stood on the ridge above him, its breath clouding in the cold air. The younger 2 were half hidden, their coats dusted with snow. They weren't foraging, and they weren't passing through. They were waiting. Daniel's pulse quickened. He took a cautious step forward, keeping his hands visible. The big bear huffed again, then turned uphill. The younger ones followed, and without fully understanding why, Daniel did too. The climb was steep, the snow crunching under his boots. Every few yards, the bears would pause, looking back to ensure he was still behind them. The trail narrowed into a shadowed pass between granite outcrops, where the wind dropped away and the air grew unnervingly still. They stopped at the crest. From here, Daniel could see a deep hollow in the valley beyond, rimmed by fallen pines. And there, half buried in snow, was something out of place, a shape that didn't belong to the wilderness. He moved closer, the bears hanging back. It was a snowmobile. Half collapsed against the base of a rock face, its frame twisted, the windshield shattered. And sprawled beside it, motionless, was a person. Daniel's breath hitched. He slid down into the hollow, his boots slipping on the icy slope. The man, maybe mid-30s, was alive, but barely. His parka was torn, his face pale, lips tinged blue. Judging by the tracks, he'd crashed hard, then tried to move before the cold took over. One leg was pinned under the wreckage. Daniel dropped to his knees, his training kicking in. He checked for a pulse, weak, but there. Hypothermia had already set in. He unclipped his radio. "Base, this is Whitaker. I've got an injured male, possible compound fracture, severe hypothermia, location." He rattled off coordinates, his voice urgent. "Request immediate medevac. I'll start warming procedures." As he worked, he glanced back toward the ridge. The big bear was still there. Watching. Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. The moment was impossible to explain, this silent, mutual acknowledgement that he wouldn't have found this man without them. By the time the rescue team arrived, the bears had slipped away into the trees, leaving nothing but their prints in the snow. When the chopper lifted off, Daniel stood alone in the hollow, staring at those tracks. The way they circled back from the valley rim, the way they stopped exactly where he'd first seen them, like they'd been waiting for him to catch up. It was becoming impossible to write these encounters off as coincidence. Something was happening here. Back at the ranger station, Daniel couldn't shake the image of those prints in the snow, 3 sets, 1 massive and 2 smaller, each perfectly aligned in a way that felt intentional. That night, he spread a topographical map across his kitchen table, marking each place he'd seen the bears. The meadow. The ridge. The frozen river bend. The mountain pass where they'd found the snowmobile crash. When he connected the dots, something strange happened. They formed a sweeping arc, almost like a loose boundary around the northern range. It didn't look random. It looked patrolled. The next day, curiosity got the better of him. He dug into the old wildlife records stored in the dusty metal filing cabinet at the back of the station. Most were mundane: deer counts, predator sightings, migration patterns. But halfway through the second drawer, he found an unlabeled folder stuffed with yellowed paper. Inside were old incident reports from more than 20 years ago, signed by a name he recognized from local history: Hank McAllister. The first report made Daniel sit back in his chair. Located 3 orphaned bear cubs on East Ridge during blizzard. Severe hypothermia. Transported to station, stabilized overnight before transfer to wildlife rescue. Cubs appeared 4 to 6 months old. Notable, smallest cub missing a notch in left ear. Daniel's heart kicked. The big bear he'd seen, the one with the scar, could have been that smallest cub, now fully grown. He kept reading. There were follow-up notes from the Wildlife Center. The cubs had been raised in rehabilitation enclosures until they were old enough to fend for themselves, then released back into the wild in a remote area of the park. Their tags eventually fell off or stopped transmitting. The file ended there. For a long moment, Daniel just sat at the table, the only sound the slow tick of the wall clock. If these were the same bears, and his gut told him they were, then they had survived for decades, thriving in the wild, and somehow, against every expectation, remembered. Later that week, Daniel hiked to the Oak Ridge where Hank was rumored to have lived after retirement. The cabin was long abandoned, the porch sagging, the windows clouded with dust. In the shed out back, under a tarp, he found a wooden crate. Inside were old field notebooks, Hank's handwriting neat and precise. The last entry stopped him cold. "Sometimes I think they're watching. Not in a dangerous way. In the way you watch someone you once trusted to carry you through the storm. I hope, if they ever see me again, they'll know I never forgot them." Daniel closed the notebook slowly. The thought that had been circling in his mind for weeks now settled firmly into place. These bears weren't just crossing paths with him by chance. They had a purpose. That purpose became terrifyingly clear one overcast afternoon in early March. Daniel was patrolling near a frozen creek when the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound, not an animal, not the creak of ice, but something sharper. A shout. He called out, but there was no answer. Then he saw them, the three bears, standing on the far bank, all facing the same direction, ears pricked. Without hesitation, the big bear began moving upstream, the younger two flanking behind. Daniel followed, scrambling over ice-slick rocks until the sound came again, louder this time, a man's voice, desperate. They found him wedged between two fallen logs at the creek bend, one leg pinned, the current threatening to drag him under the thinning ice. The rescue took all of Daniel's strength, but they made it. By the time he looked up, the bears were gone. No sound, no movement in the trees, just their tracks leading back into the wild. 2 days after the creek rescue, Daniel decided to take a route he rarely used, a winding ridge trail that overlooked the northern valley. The air was sharp with the scent of melting snow, and patches of exposed earth hinted that spring wasn't far off. Halfway along the ridge, he paused at a narrow overlook. The valley stretched below, still dusted in white, with the dark thread of the river snaking through it. He was just about to continue when a soft crunch of snow came from behind him. Daniel turned slowly. There, not 20 feet away, stood the massive bear with the scarred ear. Up close, the animal was even larger than he remembered, its fur thick and dark, the winter coat still clinging in heavy tufts. For a long moment, neither moved. The bear's breath rose in slow clouds, the deep brown eyes locked on him with a focus that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Daniel didn't reach for his camera. He didn't even think to move his hand toward the bear spray on his belt. Instead, he stood still, letting the quiet pass between them. The wind shifted, carrying a faint whistle through the pines. The bear huffed, short, low, and deliberate. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, the younger bears emerged from the tree-line, flanking their elder. It was the first time he had seen them so close together in full light. The smaller of the two lingered behind, cautious, while the larger stepped forward, mirroring the scarred bear's calm stance. Daniel's chest tightened. There was no aggression here, no fear. Just recognition. He thought of Hank's last journal entry, "If they ever see me again, they'll know I never forgot them." And in that moment, Daniel felt he was standing exactly where Hank once had, a quiet, unspoken bond bridging years, species, and storms. Slowly, Daniel gave a single nod. The scarred bear blinked once, then turned and walked toward the tree-line, the others following. Within seconds, they were gone, absorbed into the shadow and snow. Daniel stood there for several minutes afterward, the air around him heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He knew the next time might be years away, or it might never come at all. But he also knew this: some connections didn't need constant presence to endure. They were carried in memory, in instinct, in the unspoken trust built in a single night of desperate rescue. And now, as the ridge wind swirled around him, Daniel understood what Hank had meant. A week after the ridge encounter, the mountains were wrapped in a slow, steady snowfall, the kind that muffled sound and softened every outline. Daniel sat at his desk in the ranger station, flipping through Hank's old journal for what must have been the 100th time. The pages were worn, the handwriting a steady, unhurried scrawl. Near the back was a passage he hadn't noticed before. If the day comes when you stand where I stood, remember, it isn't about what you gave them. It's about what they gave you without even knowing it. The words stayed with him all afternoon. By sunset, he knew what he needed to do. Daniel packed a small wooden box. Inside, he placed a printed copy of the rescue report from that night years ago, a photo of Hank smiling in front of the station, and a smooth river stone he had carved with 3 simple lines, one longer, 2 shorter, just like the 3 bears he had seen. He hiked up the ridge trail, the same one from last week, until the forest opened to a clearing that faced the valley. Snow fell in fine, glittering flakes, catching the last light of the day. Daniel set the box beneath a tall pine, pressing it gently into the snow at the base. He stayed there a while, the cold biting at his cheeks, watching the tree lean. There was no movement. No sign of them. But as he turned to leave, he heard it, a low, steady huff carried on the wind. Daniel froze. Slowly, he looked back. In the distance, barely visible through the snowfall, the scarred bear stood at the edge of the trees. Behind it, the 2 younger bears emerged, their coats dusted with white. None of them moved closer. They didn't need to. Daniel raised a gloved hand in silent acknowledgement. The bears stood for a moment longer, the snow swirling between them, before they turned and disappeared into the forest shadows. Walking back down the ridge, Daniel felt a calm settle over him. He didn't know if he'd ever see them again, and that was all right. Some stories weren't meant to be repeated, just carried forward. And he would carry this one for the rest of his life. That night, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, Daniel made one last entry in his own journal. 3 cubs in a storm. 3 bears on a ridge. And a truth that won't let go: the wild remembers.